Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of The Closing. Here at Banker and Tradesman, we are closely watching the real estate market, sales and foreclosures in Massachusetts. Experts here at our parent company, the Warren Group, constantly say the only way the market will improve is to bring up those unemployment numbers. Lucky for us, we have Stephen Carhart here as our guest today. In addition to researching the job market, Steve is also president and CIO of Boston-based Trust and Fiduciary Management Services, Inc., and the recent new co-host of Financial Insight with Ron Birnbaum and Steve Carhart, which airs every Sunday from 4 to 5 p.m. on 96.9. Today we're turning the mic on him to get some insight. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Michelle. Great to be here.
Great to have you. So we're talking about the housing market and how it is starting to see some signs of recovery, but the real issue facing the nation is that many Americans just simply can't find a job, and these two things are tied hand in hand. What kind of things are you finding when you're researching this issue?
Well, I think the important idea is that they're very much linked, and that the reason that we are not seeing much improvement in employment is we're not seeing much improvement in demand from the consumer. We're seeing little. And that is because of something that a lot of politicians don't want to talk about, and that's the overhang from the subprime crisis. All of these bad mortgage securities that we have now forgotten about 6 or 12 months later are still on the books of the banks. And as long as they're on the books of the banks are reluctant to lend because they are afraid that they may have to write those down, and they're keeping extra reserves. Additionally, on the consumer side, and again I'm talking very broadly about the households in the United States, all of this heavy mortgage debt is still on their books. Many folks, as you know, are underwater in their mortgages. And as long as consumers have that much debt, and now it's about 100% of GDP, whereas historically it's about 60%, until that debt gets paid down, the consumers are not going to be able to borrow much more. So we have to deflate this debt in some way or other, write it down, pay it off, declare it a loss before we can go forward at our normal rate. And until that happens, I'm afraid that real growth in the U.S. economy is going to be limited to 1 to 3% rather than the 4 to 5 to 6% in real terms that we ordinarily see during a significant recovery.
So are there any opportunities to create jobs?
Well, I think there are, but they're away from the places that a lot of political people and some businessmen are talking about. The research we're doing draws heavily on the work of Professor Michael Porter at Harvard and his cluster mapping project. He develops the idea of economic clusters, and this is, you'll hear people talk about bringing manufacturing back, and it's that idea, but it's much broader, in that a cluster is an economic development area that sells beyond its own borders. And what Professor Porter has found over the years is that those kinds of regional specializations where a region sells its goods beyond its region are where the high-wage jobs are. And if you extend that notion beyond, manufacturing is of course part of it, but we would include things like the entertainment industry in Los Angeles, which sells to a world market. They don't exactly manufacture anything. It's all sort of intangible, but it has high wages and high salaries and is a major growth area. Or some place as sort of simple as you think of Las Vegas. You think maybe hotels and restaurants, they have very high wages compared to hotels and restaurants that just serve local markets. So that's the idea of a cluster. And the idea which is not being discussed in Washington is the idea of evaluating what clusters there are in the United States that could grow in the current environment. None of the parties are talking meaningfully about creating jobs. So if I were the president, what I would be talking about is I would be looking at clusters in the United States that have major export markets that are already large that could grow faster than they have in the past. Things that fit that category that we conventionally think of are things like information technology, biomedical technologies, high-tech heavy equipment. But there are a couple of areas that I think are really exciting for potential growth that really haven't gotten any attention, and those are energy and agriculture. Many of our listeners may have read that there has been a major discovery of natural gas under the shale in the upper Midwest and in the middle Atlantic states. And that's an enormous amount of gas that we could produce that will produce a lot of jobs both in producing the gas and in the equipment that goes into producing the gas. And if we do it right, we can even export it to Europe and have a big growth industry. And that whole area is an industry that's large enough that if it grows above trend over the next 5 or 10 years, you could create millions of jobs in that area that would be high-wage jobs, and begin to replace some of the jobs we've lost, and particularly jobs in places like construction and finance, which I think probably will not come back for a long time. Sad to say for those of us who are involved in some of those industries.
Well, that's very interesting. In the meantime, things aren't getting much better. The Department of Labor came out with their unemployment claims, which found that nationwide they went up, and in Massachusetts they saw an increase with 3,804. So that's not such good news. You know, what's going on there? It's just not looking much better.
Well, that's correct, and I think that one of the things that we need to do is try to find some way to assist the banks in removing these bad loans from their balance sheets. I propose that we have a new Resolution Trust Corporation modeled along the lines of the original Resolution Trust Corporation that provided a similar role in the savings and loan crisis when they had bad commercial mortgages. And I think that if these loans could be bought out of the banks at a discount and then divided up to specialized managers, I would say a sort of a triage. You send the good loans to people that you're used to having good mortgages. You send the ones that have been foreclosed to people that are used to liquidating physical properties, and the ones that need to be renegotiated you send to regional banks and have them work those out with the homeowners. That would then chew through this overhang of bad loans and get more to a point where borrowers could borrow and lenders would lend.
Now, on your radio show, Financial Insight, you talk about these issues and many other things. What are some of the kind of hot topics right now?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're really excited to be back. Ron and I are really excited to be back on now with WTKK. The employment issue is a big one. We also talk a lot about how investors should position themselves in this environment. So we talk a lot about what investors can do to position themselves from an investment point of view in this.
Well, great. It was so interesting having you here, Steve. Really appreciate you coming in.
It's been a great pleasure, Michelle. I really appreciate you taking the time, and best of luck with the podcast programs.
Thank you, and we'll be here next week again for another installment of The Closing.